The transport pod hissed as its seal decompressed, and a rush of dry, ionized air swept into the cabin. Eli Bradley stood at the open hatch, his boots firmly planted on the metal ramp as his eyes scanned the unfamiliar terrain of Norvan 12. Wind howled across the cracked plains, kicking up pale dust and sending it spiraling into the reddish-orange sky. Above, storm clouds churned like boiling ink, promising acid rain and unforgiving nights. This was no ordinary survival exercise. This was the Galactic Survival Course's final exam, and only the most resilient would pass. Eli didn't flinch. He adjusted the straps of his backpack and stepped out onto the soil with measured calm, unlike the alien cadets beside him, who hesitated or visibly shivered in anticipation. The professor's voice rang through their headsets, firm, mechanical, and emotionless. Your task is simple. Build a functional shelter within 48 standard hours using only materials found on this moon. No imported technology permitted except personal survival tools and suits. This is not a group task. Evaluation is individual. The message ended with a buzz, and the professor's presence vanished from the neural link. From this point forward, the cadets were alone. Eli glanced at the others. To his left, a towering insectoid named Jorthak snapped his mandibles and immediately began scanning the ground with a glowing sensor wand. To his right, a gelatinous being named Furima slithered toward the jagged rocks, her bioluminescent skin dimming under the clouded sky. A dozen other species scattered across the terrain, each with a unique physiology and survival strategy. Some began cutting crystalline roots from the soil. Others used tools to melt and mold the mineralized sand. There was tension in their movements, a frantic urgency to beat the storm that would inevitably strike by nightfall. But Eli didn't rush. He crouched down, scooped a handful of dirt, and let it trickle through his fingers. Dry, coarse, low clay content. Not ideal for bricks, but perhaps usable with bonding agents. He then moved toward a cluster of boulders and struck one with a small hammer from his belt. The stone gave a dull thud, solid and uniform, perfect for structural support. He marked the spot with a metal peg and moved on, methodically assessing his surroundings. While others fought the wind, he worked with it, using his scarf to gauge the direction and speed. He wasn't just looking for materials, he was reading the land, learning its temperament. The training at Earth's Survival Institute had been rigorous. From Arctic snow camps to Saharan oases, Eli had studied not only how to survive, but how to live, comfortably, even luxuriously, when others barely made it. His instructors had often said, "Humans don't survive because of strength. We survive because we adapt and innovate." Those words echoed now in his mind as he located a dry ridge slightly elevated from the basin where most of the other cadets had clustered. It was shielded on three sides by natural rock formations, breaking the wind. He could already envision the cabin taking shape here. Back at the lower ground, chaos reigned. Jorthok's chosen crystal wood kept snapping under pressure. Furima's structure collapsed twice due to instability in the gelatin she secreted for adhesion. Shouts, curses, and alien screeches filled the air, echoing through the canyons. Eli simply tuned it all out. He placed a small device on the ground, his personal compass and thermal scanner, allowed under course rules for initial planning. The readings were useful. The ridge retained slightly more heat during the day and cooled slower at night. That would help reduce thermal shock after sunset. With a satisfied nod, he began the first phase, clearing the ground. His shovel, modified with a reinforced alloy edge, cut smoothly into the dirt. He worked in rhythmic strokes, outlining the perimeter with absolute precision. He wasn't building a hut, he was building a home, something that would stand as a testament to what one well-trained human could achieve under pressure. As he worked, he spotted small metallic shards scattered among the soil. Curved, thin, and highly reflective. He picked one up, wiped the dust, and grinned. Solar reactive alloy, probably from an old probe or drone. Crash. To most, it was just debris. To Eli, it was a gold mine. He began collecting the pieces and carefully packing them into his satchel. Each one could be turned into a reflector, a power conductor, or even a basic heating panel. He wouldn't use it just yet. He still had to establish the main frame. But already he was thinking 10 steps ahead. While the alien students hacked at crystal trees and struggled with gravity differentials, Eli methodically cut and stacked long fibrous stalks that resembled bamboo. They were hollow, surprisingly light, and resilient to snapping. With the right lashings, they could serve as both structure and insulation. He tested a few joints with the bonding sap he'd discovered along the ridge and found that the material hardened like resin under pressure and time. Perfect. By midday, while others were barely erecting their first walls, Eli had dug out a leveled foundation, gathered a stockpile of structural material, and erected a basic A-frame. He paused only to drink, filtering the water he'd harvested from a damp crevice with a charcoal pouch from his survival kit. Above, the clouds darkened further. The first drops of acidic rain began to fall, sizzling against the rocks. Shouts of panic rang out across the basin as alien shelters buckled under the chemical assault. Eli calmly unrolled a tarp over his frame. Woven from the reflective alloy, it deflected the droplets like armor. He anchored the corners and slid underneath, continuing his work with focused determination. As others ran for cover, he sat cross-legged, carving joints and slots into his materials using a multi-tool and assembling the next phase of his cabin skeleton. Night fell quickly on Norvan 12. Temperatures plummeted. Most cadets huddled under makeshift covers, their shelters barely functional, some still exposed to the elements. A few students activated emergency heat packs, violating the assignment's rules, likely resulting in automatic failure. But Eli sat in quiet confidence beneath his half-finished structure. He lit a low-heat fire pit using non-toxic fuel extracted from local lichen and wrapped himself in an emergency thermal blanket while reviewing his plans on a waterproof slate. He wasn't rushing, he wasn't improvising, he was executing. Every piece of wood, every metal shard, every scoop of dirt had a purpose in his mind. He envisioned not just survival, but sustainability, comfort, efficiency. The storm raged outside, and yet inside his rudimentary shelter there was calm. A space was taking form, a space that would soon become a marvel to those who believed humans were merely adaptable, not extraordinary. As he drifted into sleep for a few hours, protected from wind and rain, the ridge above the basin glowed faintly in the storm. Alone, lit by faint thermal light and scattered solar shards, it looked like the outline of a human triumphing over the alien world itself. And the real test hadn't even begun yet. Morning broke on Norvan 12, though the sun was barely visible through the sickly green overcast that blanketed the sky. Acidic mist clung to the rocks, giving the landscape a surreal glow. Eli emerged from his makeshift tarp covering and exhaled deeply into the cold, damp air. His joints ached slightly from the firm ground, but his mind was razor-sharp. The night's temperature drop had been brutal, and judging by the clusters of movement in the valley below, not everyone had fared as well. He could see several cadets huddled in collapsed structures, their outer skins discolored by exposure. One shelter had completely disintegrated during the night. A few others bore signs of patchwork repairs, none of which would hold through another storm. But Eli had no time to observe failure. His own build was still only a skeleton if he wanted to meet his vision. A shelter that provided comfort, not just survival. He needed to accelerate. He opened his backpack and retrieved a thin metal canister, popping the seal and pouring its contents into a crude basin formed from a curved stone. Water from the filtered crevice. Not much, but enough. He added a few crushed roots he had tested for edibility the day before, igniting his small fire pit with dried lichen as tinder. Within minutes, steam rose. A simple breakfast, but warm and revitalizing. He ate quickly, wiped his tools, and stood. The A-frame was intact and dry. The resinous sap he'd used had hardened well overnight. He knocked gently on one of the vertical supports and heard a satisfying ring of tension. It had bonded. He began assembling the secondary framework, inserting cross beams and bracing them with interlocked grooves and pressure-fit joints. He wasn't relying on nails or adhesives for structural integrity. Everything had to hold together through tension and balance. Every angle, every connection had to be calculated. The plan in his mind was precise. Triangular geometry for stability, hollow stalks for insulation, compressed moss for inner wall padding. He spent 2 hours reinforcing the lower wall sections, leaving gaps for future installation of vents and insulation. He then transitioned to collecting more of the solar reactive shards scattered near the edge of the ridge. These were crucial, not just for later electrical systems, but for passive heating. He knew their molecular structure could reflect and store light, even in weak atmospheres. He mapped the sun's path, factoring in Norvan 12's axial tilt and slow rotation, and calculated the optimal angles for installing the panels on the structure's southern wall. The calculations weren't perfect without a digital interface, but years of practice made his guesses close enough to matter. As the cabin rose beam by beam, the contrast between Eli and the others became glaring. Jorthak was busy salvaging remnants of his overnight failure, trying to fuse his broken dome with adhesive foam he'd brewed from fermenting root sacs. His forearms moved fast, but lacked finesse. He kept glancing toward Eli's ridge, antennae twitching, his posture betraying frustration. Farima had retreated into a protective bubble she secreted from her skin, trying to warm herself internally. Her structure had collapsed again. Two other cadets, one with obsidian scales and another with translucent wings, were attempting to combine resources, but their efforts remained clumsy and inefficient. Eli noticed none of it. His focus narrowed as he began work on the floor. He didn't want to sleep on hard soil again. He arranged flat stones, evenly spaced and aligned in a tessellated pattern, filling the gaps with compacted dirt and sticky bark paste. Over that he laid long mats made from shredded fiber and woven plant strips, forming a springy, warm base. It wasn't just practical, it was artful. The natural lines of the stone and fibers blended with the environment. The interior would soon resemble a human cabin, not a temporary hideout. He took a short break, not out of fatigue, but to think. Sitting on a low rock with his slate in hand, he outlined the wiring concept for solar integration. He would connect the solar shards through copper veins embedded in local vines. When dried, the vines became rigid and somewhat conductive. If reinforced with reactive metal from the debris nearby, he could create a circuit. It wouldn't power machinery, but it could support heat coils, basic lighting, and maybe even purify water through slow heating. By mid-afternoon, the clouds had thinned slightly, allowing for partial sunlight. Eli seized the opportunity. He climbed to the top of the frame, anchored the primary solar collector, a makeshift panel constructed from aligned shards set in a frame of braided root and resin, and angled it just right. He tethered it with tension cables and checked its stability twice. When he finally descended, sweat marked his brow, but the glow in his eyes was unmistakable. He was ahead of schedule. Next came the interior division. He didn't want an open floor. A survival shelter was one thing, a living space was another. He installed a half wall between the sleeping area and what would become a compact utility space. He planned to install a thermal coil near the entrance, using solar energy to heat an inner stone cavity that would release warmth during the night. For water collection, he shaped a gutter system from flexible bark strips, redirecting rain into a filtered stone basin outside. He even thought of a venting chimney to keep smoke from lingering indoors if he needed fire later. A low hum buzzed from his test circuit. The solar collector had started to store energy. The buzz was faint, barely perceptible, but it was progress. Eli sat near the corner and began assembling the first internal feature. A seat carved from solid rock, smoothed with lichen and covered with moss for comfort. He leaned back into it, tested the balance, and smiled. Others would be trying to survive the next night. He would be drinking tea inside a structure that defied expectations. As the second day came to a close, the professor's neural link crackled to life with a short announcement. 24 hours remaining. Evaluation begins at final hour. Reminder, unauthorized external tools or assistance will result in disqualification. Then, silence. Eli didn't even look up. He was soldering together copper strips using a makeshift arc created with sunlight and a curved shard. His fingers were calloused, his arms aching, but his mind was at peace. Night approached, and again the storm winds stirred. Shrieks echoed from the valley. Another structure had failed. Cries for help were muffled by the roar of wind. Eli heard them, but he did not react. He had warned no one. He had built for one. That was the rule. Comfort was earned, not shared. Not yet. He climbed inside the now fully enclosed space, sealed the opening flap made of water-repelling leaves, and sat cross-legged on his padded floor. The wind howled. The structure did not move. Heat radiated from the stone cavity by the door. The interior was calm, insulated. A faint glow pulsed from the embedded shards in the walls. He poured water into a metal cup and set it on the warming stone. He watched as steam slowly rose, wrapping him in silence. Outside, alien students braved the worst night of the test. Inside, Eli prepared for the final stretch, not as a survivor, but as a builder of something more. The storm had passed, but its fury had left a clear message. Broken shards of alien shelters littered the valley below the ridge. Some structures still stood, barely, leaning like wounded creatures, supported by makeshift props or held together with raw desperation. Few cadets had managed to sleep. The wind had howled well into the night, slamming against fragile constructs, infiltrating gaps, and stealing warmth. Furima had not emerged from her membrane dome since sundown. Jorthak had managed to rebuild a third of his shelter but had abandoned it before midnight. Now he stood in silence, glaring up at the ridge, arms folded, antennae twitching. His jealousy was not hidden well. Eli stepped out of his cabin and stretched, his joints clicking in the cold air. The solar wall had held through the night. Heat from the insulated stone core still radiated through the floor, keeping the cabin's interior warm and dry. He took a slow breath and scanned the sky. Thinner clouds, a weak sun struggling to break through. He estimated at least 5 hours of light before the temperature dropped again, just enough to finalize the external systems. He turned, unhooked a folded set of tools from the cabin wall, and knelt beside the gutter system to inspect the rain collection basin. The basin had filled halfway during the storm. Acidic content was high, but the stone filter had performed adequately. With a few small tweaks, additional moss layers, tighter packing, he could push the water's purity within drinkable thresholds without needing to boil it. He began reinforcing the filter using softened bark pulp, packing it tight, sealing it with resin, and then carving a spout for controlled access. A small pebble jam served as a primitive valve. As he worked, his mind shifted to the interior. The cabin needed light. He retrieved the copper-veined vines he had set aside and began trimming them to fit into the interior grooves along the ceiling. Each vine had been dried overnight beside the thermal stone, their internal sap hardened to form rigid channels. He inserted solar reactive shards at intervals and embedded tiny copper strips between them. Then, using a curved shard and polished stone, he focused sunlight onto the initial panel. The reaction was immediate. Light pulsed down the vine as electrons jumped across the metal trace. It wasn't bright, but it was functional. A soft amber glow illuminated the cabin from above. He tested the circuit again, this time connecting a secondary line to a coil he had wrapped around the heat core. The result? Slow, sustained warmth supported by the growing solar charge. He smiled to himself. Not out of pride, but from the satisfaction of seeing design meet function. Comfort wasn't just a luxury. It was proof of mastery. Movement below caught his eye. Jorthak was approaching. The insectoid's heavy frame stomped through the loose dust, his eyes fixed on the ridge, mandibles tight. Eli stood quietly, arms crossed, waiting. When the cadet reached the base, he didn't speak. Instead, he lifted a piece of his failed structure, twisted crystalline tubing, and threw it to the ground. It cracked loudly but did not shatter. Eli raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Jorthak's antennae fluttered in frustration. The silent message was clear, resentment. Eli turned away and returned to his work. He had no interest in confrontation. The ridge was his, the structure was his. If others had failed, it wasn't his burden to carry. He finished sealing the vine light system and moved to the east wall. There, he began carving a small recess into the stone, a ledge for a set of flat plates made from polished debris. He would use them for drying herbs he had gathered, minor stimulants found in local moss that sharpened focus and helped stave off fatigue. While others begged for warmth and shelter, he had already moved to the level of optimization. By midday, 2 alien cadets from the far side of the valley approached cautiously. One had wings that shimmered with translucent colors, the other wore a visor over his eyeless face. They spoke briefly at the base of the ridge, pointing at Eli's structure, then turned back without ascending. Word had spread. While others patched holes and reinforced walls with hope, the human had moved beyond survival. He had light, he had warmth, he had structure. Inside, he began organizing the interior into distinct zones. Sleeping, cooking, utility. Each space was optimized, not crowded. He even installed a partition made of soft lichen and bark strips, braided into a flexible curtain to separate the sleeping area. The fire pit was enclosed in a stone triangle that funneled smoke through a narrow exit vent he carved near the roof. The flow worked. Smoke rose smoothly without filling the room. A test fire burned clean, and the interior stayed warm without overwhelming heat. By now the wind had picked up again, not as fierce as the night before, but insistent. Eli stepped outside to secure the solar panels and noticed more cadets watching from below. Their shelters stood in ruins. Some of them had bundled themselves in heat cloths. Others sat in groups, talking quietly, casting glances toward the ridge. Eli felt no pride in their failure. He had simply done what was required. He spent the next hour reinforcing the roof with flat stones, overlapping them to create a sloped barrier against wind and rain. The design followed ancient Earth principles. Simple physics, reliable form. Nothing extravagant, just effective. When the final stone was placed, he added a ridge cap made from the toughest bark he could find, bound tightly with resin thread. It looked primitive, but it would last. The sky darkened prematurely as a new storm front approached. Eli ducked back inside, sealed the door flap, and began preparing for the second night. He placed a small pot of filtered water on the thermal stone and added 2 moss leaves. As steam rose, he sat back against the padded wall and watched the golden threads of light pulse gently along the ceiling. The air was warm, the floor was soft. Outside the wind howled, but inside was peace. He knew what was coming. The professor's evaluation was inevitable. His cabin would either pass or fail by the standards of an alien academy that believed technology had to be complex, futuristic, or exotic. He had taken another path, one grounded in simplicity and ingenuity, not because he wanted to impress, but because he knew the truth. Comfort and efficiency didn't have to be synthetic. They just had to work. A crack of thunder shook the ground. Rain began to fall again. He leaned forward, opened the flaps slightly, and watched the water pour into the gutter system. It flowed into the basin with a smooth hiss, filtered instantly, redirected with precision. Every part of the system functioned in harmony. He closed the flap and leaned back again, his eyes closed, not from exhaustion, but because there was nothing left to worry about. Tomorrow would bring judgment, but tonight Eli slept in the warmest, driest, and most advanced shelter on the moon. Morning came not with sunlight, but with a dull thrum in the soil, a low vibration that pulsed through the ground like the heartbeat of Norvan 12 itself. Eli stirred from his place beside the thermal stone and sat upright, instinctively reaching for his multi-tool. The storm had passed once more, but the air carried a strange stillness, heavy and expectant. He rose to his feet, his boots pressing against the soft moss lining he had laid across the stone floor. A glance toward the ceiling confirmed his lighting system still functioned. The copper vanes glowed faintly, powered by the remnants of yesterday's solar charge. Satisfied, he packed his flask, secured his tool pouch, and stepped out of the cabin. Outside, the terrain had transformed. The acidic rain had left behind silvery rivulets running through the dirt, carving channels across the slope. In the valley below, the other shelters looked like remnants of a failed civilization. 2 structures had completely collapsed, and what little remained of the others sagged under the weight of soaked materials and poor design. Alien cadets moved sluggishly, their bodies covered in makeshift wraps, some clinging to each other for warmth. Their expressions, though alien in form, were unmistakable in emotion. Exhaustion, resignation, envy. He walked the perimeter of his cabin, checking each anchor point, each solar panel, each gutter. The rain had washed away loose debris, revealing the clean edges of his design. He adjusted the angle of a panel slightly to maximize the meager morning light, and then cleared silt from the drainage spout. The rhythm of the task calmed him. Precision was his ritual. Halfway through his routine, he noticed someone approaching the ridge again. It was Farima, the gelatinous cadet who had stayed cocooned for 2 nights. Her movements were slow, her form duller than before, the once bright luminescence of her skin reduced to a pale flicker. She paused a few meters from the base of the ridge and looked up. Her large eyes blinked without expression. She said nothing. Eli nodded once but remained silent. She didn't need words. Her intent was obvious. She had endured 2 nights of exposure, and now the temperature was dropping again. Her shelter was useless. She wanted warmth, a chance to recover. He turned away and entered his cabin, leaving the flap open behind him. Inside, he opened a small storage recess beneath the bench and removed an insulated drinking vessel. He filled it with heated water from the thermal core, dropped in 2 strips of dried moss, stirred it with a piece of flat wood, and set it aside. Then he sat cross-legged on the floor and waited. The flap rustled. Farima entered slowly, pausing just past the threshold. Her body quivered from the sudden change in temperature. She scanned the interior, her translucent form catching the golden glow of the copper lights. Her eyes widened slightly at the organized interior, the layered walls, the filtered water system. Without asking, she lowered herself beside the heat stone and remained still. Eli slid the cup toward her. She accepted it with a soft chirp and held it near her surface. The steam made her glow faintly again. Neither of them spoke. There was no need. Footsteps outside interrupted the silence. Heavy, scraping boots. A moment later, Jorthak's figure appeared at the flap. His mandibles clicked sharply and his upper arms flexed. He stared at the scene inside, at the warmth, at the lighting, at Farima huddled beside the thermal stone. His antennae vibrated with tension. Eli stood slowly. Jorthak didn't move. "You're not here for company," Eli said. Jorthak didn't answer. His eyes remained fixed on the light source above, then dropped to the cup in Farima's grip. Jealousy radiated from him like heat. Eli stepped forward and blocked the entrance. "You're not coming in." Jorthak's claws twitched. His lower limbs dug slightly into the ground. He took a step forward. Eli didn't back away. He reached for the door flap, lifted it, and snapped it shut between them. Inside, silence returned. Farima didn't move. Eli sat again and resumed sketching designs on his slate. He didn't look up. The remainder of the day passed with quiet efficiency. Farima assisted him by retrieving small materials from nearby resin, filtered soil, stiff bark, though her movements remained slow. She watched him repair a vent seal, helped pack moss into insulation gaps, and remained close to the heat source whenever she paused. He didn't question her. She hadn't asked to stay, but she hadn't left either. As the sun dipped lower, the storm clouds returned. The wind picked up, swirling dust into the air. This time it was dry, gritty, blinding. Eli sealed the flap again and dimmed the internal light to conserve energy. He prepared another drink, handing it to Farima without a word. She accepted it without resistance. She had no strength left for pride. Outside, angry voices rose. At least 2 other cadets were arguing loudly, their silhouettes visible through the canvas slit. Someone shouted in frustration, and a structure collapsed with a groan. Eli closed his eyes and exhaled slowly. Survival had fractured the group. The assignment had begun as a competition, but desperation had turned it into quiet war. He prepared a 3rd cup and set it on the stone beside him. A second visitor was inevitable. Jorthak returned near sunset. He stood at the flap again, not speaking. His shoulders sagged and his limbs trembled slightly. Pride had carried him as far as it could. The storm had humbled him. His forearms hung low, claws loose. He didn't look angry now. He looked tired. Eli didn't speak. He opened the flap. Jorthak entered without eye contact. He took 2 steps, then collapsed near the far wall, pressing his back against the padded surface. He didn't ask for anything. Eli handed him the waiting cup. The insectoid took it with both upper arms and drank. The cabin, once built for 1, now housed 3. Night fell. The wind screamed. The flap trembled but held. The walls didn't shake. Inside, the temperature remained steady. The light remained soft. The water was clean. The heat stone glowed. Farima slept against the corner, her form undulating softly. Jorthak rested upright, limbs curled inward. Eli remained seated, eyes open, thoughts still. He had created something no one expected, and now, even his competitors were silent witnesses to what one human could build, not just for himself, but for those who had no other place to go. The final day was near. The professor's inspection would arrive soon, and when it did, the cabin would not stand as a shelter. It would stand as proof. The cabin remained still as the first rays of sunlight stretched across the jagged ridge of Norvan 12. Within its walls, warmth clung to the air like a second skin. The filtered light from above diffused across the interior, casting long golden streaks along the moss-covered floor. Eli sat upright, already awake, sharpening a piece of flat stone with a slow, careful rhythm. He had not slept much, though he did not feel tired. His body rested easily in this space now. His mind was steady. Today was the final day, and the silence in the air outside told him the professor was near. Fiorima stirred first. Her body shimmered slightly in the warmth, and for the first time since she had entered, she moved without hesitation. She looked toward Eli, then at Jorthak, who remained curled near the far wall. Eli nodded once. Fiorima understood. She gathered her strength, repositioned herself closer to the heat source, and waited. Jorthak roused next. He blinked, antennae twitching, his claws flexing slowly as if remembering where he was. He did not speak. He simply leaned forward, adjusted his posture, and let out a low, rasping breath. There was no fight in him now, only observation. A low pulse thrummed through the ground again, the same signal as before, but sharper. Eli stood, walked to the cabin entrance, and opened the flap. A shimmering distortion moved across the horizon like a ripple of heat. Then, without sound or warning, the figure of the alien professor materialized 10 meters from the ridge, tall, cloaked in flowing black fabric that barely shifted in the wind, his elongated head framed by an iridescent crest. His 6 eyes blinked independently. No words were spoken through the air. Instead, the communication entered Eli's mind like a cold breath behind the eyes. Final evaluations begin now. Eli stepped out and stood beside his structure, arms crossed loosely, gaze unwavering. Behind him, Fiorima emerged and took her place near the entrance, her shoulders raised slightly. Jorthak remained inside but watched through the opening with unblinking focus. The professor's first inspection began in the valley. He moved from one collapsed shelter to another, passing judgment without expression. Some cadets tried to speak, to explain the failures, to plead circumstances, but he responded to none of them. His neural presence pulsed with detached calculation. When he passed a structure with melted supports or incomplete walls, he paused only long enough to register a failure. Several cadets were marked without ceremony and dismissed from the course on the spot. Fiorima watched each moment unfold, her form quivering with anxiety. Eli said nothing. He remained beside his structure, steady and calm. He had no reason to fear inspection. He had done what was asked. He had done more. The professor approached the ridge last. He moved without visible effort, his cloak fluttering despite the absence of wind. When he stopped before Eli's cabin, he stared silently at the structure. His eyes scanned every surface, every angle, every curve of the layered walls. He approached the gutter system first, dipping 2 fingers into the collection basin. A faint hum echoed as he analyzed the water's composition. He turned toward the solar panels and lifted one gently, examining the mount, the angle, the integration with the surrounding materials. Then he stepped back and entered the cabin. Eli followed him inside. The professor said nothing. He examined the stonework, the insulation, the partitioned interior. His fingers brushed the copper-veined lighting system, and the light responded with a soft pulse. He studied the heating system next, then the filtered venting, the flooring, and finally the thermal core. When he turned to face Eli, his gaze lingered for several seconds. "Purpose of comfort?" the professor asked. Not aloud, but directly into Eli's consciousness. Eli answered with no hesitation. "To survive is expected, to thrive is intention. We adapt not only to endure, but to elevate." The professor remained silent. His gaze shifted to Fiorima, then to Jorthak, still watching from the inside corner. "You shared your space." Eli nodded. "No rule forbade it." "Correct." Another pulse passed through the floor, this one deeper, resonant. The professor stepped outside. All remaining cadets looked up. A moment later, the professor's voice filled their minds in unison. Evaluation complete. The list of successful candidates scrolled across their visors, transmitted instantly to each personal device. Eli saw his name first, highlighted not in standard green, but in a new color he had never seen used before. Gold. Beside him, Fiorima gasped faintly. Her name followed soon after. Then, a pause. Jorthak's name appeared, just before the list ended. He exhaled sharply, his claws loosening. Relief passed through his tense body. The professor turned back toward Eli. "You exceeded expectations." Eli waited. "You redefined the criteria." He nodded once. "You will be reassigned, not as cadet, as designer." The words struck hard, not with pride, but with consequence. Eli understood. This test had never been only about survival. It had been an audition, a filtering system not just for resilience, but for vision. And he had passed, not because he had endured the storm, but because he had built something better than what was asked. something others had turned to when their own efforts had failed. Farima stepped beside him, her body glowing brighter now. Jorthak emerged from the cabin and stood tall once more. Neither of them spoke. Words were unnecessary. The professor vanished in a blink, the distortion rippling outward. The ridge fell silent again. Above them, the first transport vessel descended, its engines whispering as it approached the landing zone. The course was over, the test complete. Eli turned to look at the cabin one last time. It remained exactly as he'd built it. Still warm, still functional, still beautiful in its purpose. It had given him shelter, yes, but more than that, it had given others proof that when humans chose to create, they didn't just survive, they inspired. And as the transport ramp lowered and the cadets ascended one by one, Eli walked last, never looking back. The cabin stayed behind, a monument to what had been possible, a symbol not just of ingenuity, but of quiet, undeniable triumph.